hello to everyone at home. My name is Alex Long. I am a program associate with the Science and Technology Innovation Program at the Wilson Center, and I am also the manager of the LGBTQI plus ERG. Thank you so much for joining us today for this discussion. I couldn't be more excited to be able to introduce our two awesome panelists who have agreed to speak with us today. So as a reminder, today's event is called U.S. Diplomacy for LGBTQIA+ rights around the world, a snapshot and a look forward. Again, I would really like to thank the Wilson Center for allowing us to host such an important discussion, especially as so much rhetoric is being thrown at the LGBTQI+ community that seems to be, setting us back all around the world. So I am here with Special Envoy Jessica Stern and Jay Gilliam. Special Envoy Stern is from the U.S. State Department, and Jay Gilliam is from USAID. And I would be giving their bios, but I know that we have a lot of young people watching and people who are early in their careers. So I would really love for our two panelists to be able to give their career bio and just a little bit of a track record on how they got to where they are today and what they do. And then we're going to dive more into the discussion, focusing around the Interagency Report on the implementation of the Presidential Memorandum on advancing human rights of the LGBTQI plus persons around the world. And then also what that work entails, what we have to do moving forward, and where we're going from here. So I know that was a lot. And again, thank you so much for joining. I'm going to throw it over to Special Envoy Stern first to give a little career bio and introduce yourself to the audience.
Thank you so much, Alex, and thank you for organizing this event, and thank you to everyone at the Wilson Center for making this space possible. Hi, everyone, and happy Pride. This is one of the last events I'm doing in the month of June in honor of Pride Month. And I love that we're eking all of the opportunity out of the month possible. Sorry about my technology. We're having some technical issues here at State, so I'm using my phone, but we're all used to having technical problems a few years into the pandemic, so hopefully the image and sound is clear. Alex, let's see, professional bio. I come out of doing, I started my career doing work on poverty and economic justice and also women's rights and gender justice. And I was doing community organizing in New York City and Philadelphia around those issues. And I felt really lucky to be doing that work because, my political convictions were clear. There was inequality of many forms in this world. But along the way, I came out as queer. And I found that a lot of the spaces that I was in during the day were not as LGBTQI plus inclusive as I would have wanted. And so more and more, I started doing community organizing in my personal life. And it led me to be a co-founding member of the Blue Stockings Bookstore Collective, which if you have ever wanted to get to know a lot of queer activists at once, join a collective. You will date half of them, but you will also read a lot of really amazing books along the way. And, my work carried me into becoming a researcher for Amnesty International USA and its LGBT rights program, as we called it at the time. And then I became the first ever researcher on LGBT rights at Human Rights Watch. And I really loved working in mainstream organizations on LGBTQI plus issues because it was a way of using the system of official credibility to bring attention to often overlooked issues. But my heart really was in being in an organization by and for LGBTQI plus people. And it led me to become the executive director of Outright Action International, which today is the world's largest global LGBTQI rights organization, and where I served as executive director for just over 10 years. And that's what I did before being named by President Biden to this position.
Awesome, thank you. And Jay, you're up next.
Sure. Well, like Jessica, happy Pride Month, and thank you, Alex and the Wilson Center for hosting this great Pride event. It's really heartening to see so many organizations, new organizations really dive into Pride Month and LGBTQI plus issues and how their work really intersects with that. As Alex said, my name is Jay Gilliam. I use pronouns he, him, his, and am the senior LGBTQI plus coordinator at USAID. As a gay Black kid who grew up in a religiously conservative Texas, I have seen really firsthand how easy it is to devalue humanity and take away my basic human rights and political rights, and those that are multiply marginalized, and the various communities and identities that I belong to. And this is all because of what I look like and who I love. Sadly, in Texas and across the country, human and political rights are still being taken away from too many groups. So there's a lot of work to be done here at home, as well as the work that we are doing abroad. Working in the global space for LGBTQI plus people, I often think about all of the different identities that bring people to the fight to be visible and valued and included. I first got a whim of what it was like to see LGBTQI plus issues from a different non-US centric perspective the first time I studied abroad and went to Japan, and just discovered how different, but also the similarities with LGBTQI plus folks there, their fight to be visible and valued and included in society. And so from that early moment on, it always, wherever I traveled, I wanted to find out, what are LGBTQI plus persons in those places doing? How are they seen? How are they included, excluded from society? And what are the things that they are fighting for, which have often been the same things that we're fighting for here in the US. I also first started working in the development space for an international NGO called the Aga Khan Foundation, and then made my way over to USAID during the Obama administration, where I worked in a number of different bureaus, starting off in communications, and then eventually working on LGBTQI plus issues with my predecessor, Todd Larson, who was the first appointed senior LGBTQI plus coordinator at USAID. And since then, I have, like I said, worked in various parts of the agency at USAID, and then during the Trump administration, left to go over to the Human Rights Campaign, where I led the global program there, where we were connecting with advocates from all over the world and supporting them in their fight for LGBTQI plus equality in the places where they lived. And then just this past November, I was excited to be appointed in the current administration to help lead efforts at USAID, where I am now.
Well, thank you so much. And I think that that is a perfect place for us to begin. Now, for everyone watching at home, please feel free to tweet using the hashtag #Pride@Wilson. And we have one of our colleagues, Ashley Shuitt, thank you so much, monitoring that hashtag, and will be feeding me questions from the audience if you guys have them. So they'll be thrown up on the side of my screen, and then I'll be able to turn to those later in the program if we get to time, because I know that we have a lot to talk about. You can also email stip@wilsoncenter.org if you have questions that you would like me to pass along as well. That's stip@wilsoncenter.org, and I'll be monitoring that. So again, thank you both so much for being here today, and let's dive in. So I think initially, what really sparked the idea for this panel was the interagency report. And what I found so compelling about the interagency report on the implementation of the Presidential Memorandum was just how wide in scope it was, and how many different agencies and how many different places in government that I did not previously know focused on issues of LGBTQI plus human rights around the world was happening. So Special Envoy Stern, I think I'm going to turn it over to you first, just to give our audience a little bit of a background on the report and how it came to be. And then Jay, I'll turn it over to you if you have anything to add after that. But I know Special Envoy Stern, the State Department took a huge lead role in this report, and I would love to hear your perspective.
Thank you, Alex. I appreciate the question. And I think you are maybe the first person I've spoken with who's used the adjective compelling to describe any government report, much less this one. But it shows the very good judgment that you have. Let me start by explaining what the report is for those that aren't as wonky as some of us, although you might be an aspiring wonk because you're here with us today. So on February 4th, 2021, President Biden released his Presidential Memorandum on LGBTQI plus inclusion in US foreign policy and foreign assistance. And this is the seminal framework document for Jay's work, for my work, and for the work of many of our colleagues across the US foreign assistance and foreign policy framework. And it's organized around core concepts. For example, the president's commitment to fighting the criminalization of LGBTQI plus status or conduct around the world, the importance of addressing the heightened vulnerabilities of LGBTQI plus asylum seekers and refugees, the methodology of supporting the UN and other global coalitions and multilateral spaces to bring an LGBTQI inclusive agenda into that space, and on and on. And you'll probably know that a framework document is essential, but an accountability process is what really gives it teeth. And so what we did this year was we released a report on the first year plus of accomplishments and follow through on that presidential memorandum. So the report was spearheaded by my office in partnership with the White House, which actually formally released the report. And it's so incredibly important, Alex, because it's actually, to the best of my knowledge, it's the first time any government anywhere in the world has ever released a report about its efforts to include LGBTQI plus issues in their foreign policies. So you might wonder, why does that matter? Well, governments being transparent matters. You're able to read this report, all 135 pages of it, and find out exactly, in as much detail as possible, what agencies are doing to implement the presidential memorandum. And, you know, every time I read it, I'm sort of moved by the revelations, large and small. For example, I was looking at the section on the Peace Corps, and one of the things that the Peace Corps reported is that they've prioritized increasing diversity in their recruitment efforts. And towards that line of effort, they held a trans-specific Peace Corps recruitment session, which is so important. I mean, it obviously matters for transgender people who wonder, will I be safe and respected within the Peace Corps? It also matters because the Peace Corps is a feeder into influential and senior positions in the State Department and other parts of government. So if the Peace Corps is not recruiting you and people like you, then you're not going to feel safe and you're not going to have access to those positions. When Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman launched the report, she said, this is not a victory lap. And I really admired her framing. The way I see the report is it was an opportunity for all of the foreign policy and foreign assistance agencies to inventory what they had accomplished to date, but by no means to sit back and rest on our laurels. It's really a chance to identify places where momentum has been easy and has been, launched, but also to identify potential opportunities for renewed effort. And we actually have a section in the report for every agency about challenges in implementing the memorandum. And it's actually that section that's perhaps the most revealing. I'd love to talk a little bit about some of the points that stood out for me as most important, but there's maybe one I want to highlight off the top because it comes from the Department of State. And I think it meant the most to me kind of at a personal level. In the report, we explain that on April 11th, the State Department made the X gender marker option available on US passport applications. Now, hopefully you've heard about this already because we've been trying to tell everyone, because anyone who needs access to an X gender marker, this is a great resource for you. And X means unspecified or another gender identity than simply male or female. This is the first federal legal identity document that takes into account the lived realities of people who don't fit squarely into a gender binary. I think this is enormously important. We are not the first country in the world to do it. We're one of the first dozen or so, but it really shows how the US is learning from other countries. We're learning from the best practices of other governments that beat us to it, but we're also very transparent that we finally got there. And we hope not only the creation of the X gender marker as a resource, but also things like this report becomes a kind of model of best practices that other governments can also follow.
So it's like following and leading all at the same time in a way, because there are so many places where we can do both of those things so well. So thank you, Special Envoy Stern. Jay, I'm wondering, do you have anything that you would like to add on USAID's involvement in creating the report? Because I think that we're going to dive into like challenges and then also things that you want to highlight from your department. But I'm just wondering your perspective on even the fact that the report and the memorandum was released.
Sure, yeah. One, just to say a big thanks to Jessica and our colleagues at State Department who did the painstaking work to assemble the report. I know it wasn't easy collecting information about the work of 14 government agencies and compiling it into something that's readable and useful for advocates, for other stakeholders in the fight for global LGBTQI plus equality. You know, I'll just say, and we'll get into some of the highlights and challenges from the USA point of view, but the exercise of being able to, you know, take an accounting of the work that we're doing and being able to share that out, I think was really important, particularly because in the last administration, this issue could not really see the light of day, right? There was no space to really highlight, to talk about, to celebrate the work that USAID staff and our colleagues in the mission and our partners are doing to promote LGBTQI plus inclusive development work. So I think in and of itself, a way for us to do an accounting and to share the great work that is happening is really important, and really excited that we could include that in this interagency report.
And for anyone at home who hasn't clicked the link, I just want to quickly read off of all of the agencies that are included in this report. It's Department of State, Development Finance Corporation, Department of Homeland Security, Department of Commerce, Department of Defense, Department of Justice, Department of Labor, Department of Health and Human Services, Millennium Challenge Corporation, Peace Corps, Department of Treasury, Export-Import Bank of the U.S., United States Agency for International Development, or USAID, and the United States Trade Representative. So it's truly something to dig into, again, as Special Envoy Stern, specifically for the wonks out there, but I do think that our audience skews very wonky. So I think that it would be great to check it out. Jay, I'm going to throw it back to you. And I think that our audience would also be really lucky to hear your description of inclusive development, because I know that there is a difference between talking about using, pushing LGBTQI plus human rights through diplomacy and the importance there. But also, I think less is perhaps known about how development plays a role in that, and your agency specifically. So if you could give some of the highlights from your department, but then also what it means to have LGBTQI plus inclusive development.
Sure, yeah. And then maybe I'll start first with kind of defining our approach in terms of inclusive development, and then some examples of what that work looks like. You know, so at USAID, when we talk about inclusive development, we're really talking about an equitable development approach that's built on understanding that every individual, every community of all diverse identities and experiences is really instrumental in transforming their own societies. This includes the engagement with LGBTQI plus people and communities throughout the development process, because we know that this leads to better outcomes. In my role as senior coordinator, I'm working with my team, I'm working with colleagues across the agency, I'm working with partners in the interagency, as well as our implementing partners at USAID to really accomplish this ambitious vision that we have. This includes pursuing integration of LGBTQI plus equities with other USAID bureaus and offices. This means pursuing localization by making USAID more accessible and welcoming to our in-country and local partners. This means connecting exciting research. We have a global barometer of transgender rights, for example, and connecting that research to actionable outcomes. And this also means ensuring that USAID, along with our partners, is a leader and a model in this space. And so, in my mind, it's being able to use all of the tools that we have in the development and humanitarian assistance space to advance the rights, to advance the benefits for LGBTQI plus persons in all the places that USAID works. And that is not to negate or to stop the important work that we do in the human rights space, but to add on that development lens and know that it's not just the human rights needs that LGBTQI plus persons face, but there are also the development challenges, whether that's in education, whether that's in health beyond HIV and AIDS, right? Whether that's in access to shelter, to food and water, to adequate support for livelihoods, right? There's all of these issues that go beyond human rights challenges for LGBTQI plus persons. And I think an inclusive development approach is really helpful in thinking about that. And just in terms of some examples of what that work looks like, I'll point to one of the things that that we highlighted in the report that I think is really, really phenomenal. We highlighted a project that USAID and PEPFAR support with Johns Hopkins University. And what we did through that program is launch the first comprehensive clinic for the transgender community in Hyderabad, India. These clinics are called MITR, which I'm pretty sure I'm not pronouncing that correctly, but it basically translates to friend in Hindi. And these clinics serve as like a one-stop shop for providing really comprehensive services for the transgender community. And they are staffed by doctors, counselors, outreach, and social workers who are actually all from the transgender community. And just last summer, 2 more health clinics were started outside of the one in Hyderabad. And so for me, this is a really clear example that LGBTQI plus folks need comprehensive access to health, right? But they also are instrumental in delivering that. And we have a role at USAID to really provide the resources and support for LGBTQI plus persons to really be transformative in their own needs and addressing that through our support and work with them.
Thank you, and congratulations on it. That's a huge achievement. And I'm really glad that we got to talk about that today. Special Envoy Stern, you talked about accomplishments that you were able to make and you and your team at the State Department were able to make. I would ask, you can add any more accomplishments that you'd like to talk about, but I would like to get into, as you already mentioned and kind of previewed, the challenges moving forward that you see from the Special Envoy's desk when it comes to challenges that the State Department can tackle when it comes to queer and trans rights around the world that we still have to focus on.
Alex, it's sort of a hard week to ask that question because, last night, Jay and I, and maybe some people on this line, were at the Vice President's residence celebrating, maybe the first ever Pride event at the Vice President's home. I mean, that's a big deal. And also I'm, tracking, so many tragedies that have also happened this week. Prides have been cracked down on around the world, including in Turkey, which actually, used to have one of the strongest and most vibrant LGBTQI movements, not just in terms of the movement's own success, but also in their forward momentum and in growing recognition at the sociocultural and political level. Many of us read in horror the news of the shooting in Oslo, Norway, at a gay club where 2 people were murdered and 12 people were injured. So the challenges are acute. And whenever I come into a place of public education and dialogue like this, I want to convey 2 things, and they are both urgency and hope. And that is my most sincere and fact-based way of framing the moment. So urgency, because the more you know about how LGBTQI plus people are treated around the world, the more heartbroken you become. The more you see systemic and individual acts of discrimination and violence, whether it's denial of healthcare, like Jay was talking about, or the inability of queer kids to go to school just like anyone else, or domestic and family violence, you know, the kinds of depression that comes from not being visible in your community or on TV or anywhere. And then, of course, you know, there's the criminalizing laws that many of us know all too well. So it's a really hard moment. And one of the things that I really worry about is a sort of new category of laws that I follow that track into two major categories. One is the attempted erasure of LGBTQI information or representation through the channels of media, whether it's online or in TV or film or in a newspaper. And then the other is the attempted silencing of any forms of LGBTQI activism, advocacy services. Basically, there's a new crop of laws that says if you're an LGBTQI plus person and you're seeking to say that your rights are not fully respected, but you believe you should be entitled to full and equal human rights, well, you're not allowed to say that. And so that's the component of urgency. And I just can't emphasize how much we need allies, whether it's LGBTQI Americans who have an international perspective, or it's, you know, straight and cisgendered people in any country around the world who are working as allies to make sure the full community is respected. We need everybody in this fight, full stop. We can't do it alone. But the other part is hope. And I think the thing that gets me out of bed every day is the feeling of hope. I have marched in a lot of pride parades this month. Sometimes my job is so lucky, I just want to pinch myself. You know, I marched in DC Pride and it was so beautiful. And at one moment I sort of looked over at the sidelines and there were so many people on the streets that there were a couple of kids that had literally climbed up a tree so that they could have a good perch to see it. And there was really good music playing and they were like dancing in the trees. And it was such like the perfect embodiment of how change is happening, right? I also marched in Pride in Vilnius, Lithuania, which was this year's site for Baltic Pride. And people told me this is the largest Pride I've ever been to. And there was so much support and you could kind of feel it very palpably in the space. You know, this week, Switzerland is seeing a law go into effect that not only legalizes equal marriage, but permits same-sex couples to adopt and also provides access to alternative insemination. You know, this month, the Thai National Assembly moved forward 4 versions of a bill that would provide a pathway to civil unions, but the version in committee is actually looking at equal marriage. And you know, I just came back from Hanoi where I was talking with the government of Vietnam about the steps they're taking for full legal gender recognition. So progress is happening. But I guess what I would say in response to your question is that I think the biggest challenge we face is that there need to be more of us. And the biggest opportunity we have is that when we engage, we make change happen.
Yeah, it's a great answer to that. And Jay, I should throw it over to you as well to talk about some of the challenges that you face when trying to promote inclusive development too. But also, please, you know, feel free to also end on a sense of hope and how these challenges do kind of open the door to like new leaders who might be, you know, watching at home today.
Sure, yeah. Let me start with a challenge and a broader one that I'm sure Jessica will agree with too, but just in the terms of where we are seeing democracies erode around the world, right? And at the President's Summit for Democracy last December, Jessica and I participated in an event and we were making clear that strong democracies are really inclusive of LGBTQI plus persons. So if any place is excluding that part of the population, they are having democratic backsliding, and supporting strong democracies is part of our national security. And so supporting LGBTQI plus persons around the world is part of our national security. So I think that's the dismal part, but the other side of the coin to that is that we know that we are part of larger movements, right? We know that it's not just the fight for global LGBTQI plus rights, but it's also the fight for strengthening democracies around the world, and that LGBTQI plus leaders, advocates, communities play a really important role in that. And I'm really excited about the efforts at USAID that we have on strengthening democracies around the world through initiatives from the Summit for Democracy. And I'm really excited to be engaging with my colleagues in those conversations around why LGBTQI plus rights, inclusive development really matter to the work that they're doing to strengthen democracies. And so that's one thing that really excites me. Also a challenge, right? Because there is a lot of work to be done in democracy building, strengthening, and oftentimes LGBTQI plus issues and equities can too often get left out of those conversations and those connections not really seen. But I do have a lot of hope that we are making that connection even stronger now than we have before in the past. The other challenge that I see, but there's also another side of the coin in terms of hope is, at USAID, our LGBTQI plus portfolio is one of the smallest resourced in the agency. And we know from the requests that we get from our mission colleagues in country in terms of getting assistance and supporting their efforts to work on behalf of LGBTQI plus persons in their programs, that we can't be doing it all. So, that is definitely a challenge that we highlighted in the report. But in terms of how we are trying to address it, working across sectors is really important for me in terms of not only ensuring that in different parts of the development work that USA does, that we are addressing the needs and challenges of LGBTQI plus persons, but also that we're able to expand the pie of resources available to do that by ensuring that through education programming at USAID, that they are addressing the needs of LGBTQI plus learners and educators. And that doesn't necessarily come as a standalone program from our office and our budget. And so I'm really excited about working with colleagues from around the agency on those integration efforts and being able to expand the resources to be able to do that. And then I think just one of the last challenges that we highlighted from the report is that we just need to be better around strategically and swiftly responding to shocks and stressors that are impacting the LGBTQI plus community around the world. This includes gender restrictive movements work around anti-gender rights. This includes humanitarian crises, which have been highlighted too much and too highlighted for not the great responses that we could be giving to LGBTQI plus persons in crisis in the humanitarian space. Ongoing efforts to support LGBTQI plus persons through COVID-19. And, the list goes on, but, what gives me hope is that we are continuing to engage with our colleagues, with our partners that are working in those spaces to highlight the importance of bringing in and integrating LGBTQI plus issues into that work to address the needs and challenges from those communities.
I think it's also important, Jay, that you brought up, first of all, thank you for that answer. And I think it's important that you brought up the national security side of things, because when we talk about diplomacy, especially in places like the Wilson Center, a foreign policy think tank primarily, national security is always on the minds of our audiences and our readers and the policymakers who follow our work. So I know that you brought up, and Special Envoy Stern, I want to give you the floor to at least talk about how, national security concerns play into your office's work advancing LGBTQI plus human rights and diplomacy.
Thanks, Alex. The Secretary of State is quite clear LGBTQI plus rights are central to US foreign policy, and LGBTQI plus rights are a national security priority. And I think, it makes a lot of sense when you think about it, because the countries that are unstable, the countries where violence is rife, the countries that, as Jay was alluding to, are anti-democratic, those are the places where extremism is born. Places where people are marginalized and excluded are places where people become angry and disenfranchised. And so one of the things that we always recommend is that to have a strong, inclusive, and prosperous society, take everyone's well-being into account. That's actually how you make countries safer, and it's how you make the world safer. And I think that using the discourse of national security in an LGBTQI plus context is a pretty new framing. There's not a long history of making these connections, but it is sorely needed. We need to say that, yes, LGBTQI plus issues fall within the buckets of human rights and development, but they also need to come into the more mainstream discourse of national security and democracy. So to my mind, the connection is obvious. There's a story from my life in civil society that I'll share on this. When I was at Outright International, we did a lot of work with LGBTQI plus people in Iraq. And I remember doing that work when ISIS took control of vast parts of Iraq and Syria. And, as many of our listeners today will recall, ISIS engaged in harrowing attacks on primarily men perceived to be gay. And we all saw images of men perceived to be gay being pushed off of rooftops and coming to other violent ends. And the point that I would always make then, and I would still make today, is that we saw those images for a reason. They weren't stealth images. They were images taken by and distributed by the official channels of communication of ISIS. So you have to ask yourself, why was that happening? And part of the answer is because, the ISIS actors believed that targeting men who have sex with men would curry favor with local populations and position themselves as credible, as guardians of morality, and also as powerful. And when you think about it, you realize that LGBTQI plus people were really used as a symbol of something much greater. And so, of course, part of the solution was to underscore that actually people in Iraq and Syria cared about LGBTQI plus people, and that they were not interested in watching violent acts against anybody, much less LGBTQI plus people. So I think the evidence is really there. What we need is more people who are making the connections, which is why it's really important that the Wilson Center has convened a space like this one. And I hope that this is definitely not the last time that we're talking about the relationship between a national security framework and LGBTQI plus inclusion.
Thanks. Yeah, I agree. And this is not the last time. We have only recently started having Pride programming every June, starting with last year. But we've had some great work that I really do think that our audience should check out. If you look up LGBTQI plus Wilson Center, you should be able to find a page where we have a lot of work from a lot of our regional programs that really does dive into these issues. And I'm just so glad that we're able to host these conversations now in a more public forum. So I really do appreciate that. And, moving forward, I guess the obvious question that might be on my mind, but then also the minds of people watching, is like what comes next. But I think that before we even get there, I do want to know to what degree, I mean, you both work in the foreign policy space. To what degree does domestic issues impact your ability to carry out work advancing LGBTQI plus human rights abroad? I know that, we've had some turbulent times politically. So how is that viewed from outside when you are coming in and, talking about promoting different rights for queer, trans, non-binary people. We'll start with Jay first, and then we'll go to Special Envoy Stern.
Sure, yeah. I mean, first of all, we always have to come to this space as Americans with humility, with knowing that we are not going to provide solutions, to provide answers, but to be working in partnership to be supporting local advocates and their needs that they've identified, and building on to the efforts that they want to see happen in their local context. And so that is always first and foremost in terms of how I approach this. Also with humility, knowing that we have not gotten everything done here. There's still a lot of work to do. We have our own issues with violence, right? Black trans women, transgender women are killed at a disproportionate rate here every year. And it has not gone down. It is not abating, and that is something that we need to continue to work on domestically. And so, you know, making sure that we are honest about the reality of the situation here at home as we are working abroad. But I also, you know, go to it to say we have privileges, we have resources that we can share and provide. We have some lessons learned. Oftentimes, we probably should be taking to heart the lessons that advocates in other places are also sharing with us and bringing those back home. But we have resources to be able to share, and we should be utilizing that because, as we've talked about, right, LGBTQI plus rights are national security issues. They are important to our values around human rights. They are important to our values around providing development assistance wherever we are. And so really this work is part and parcel of American values that we want to be sharing with the world. And part of that is doing that with humility and ensuring that we are not coming as savior complexes, but coming in partnership, coming to support what local advocates are doing.
I hope everyone is enjoying my very large hand as it approaches the camera. You know, Jay said it so well, I don't have a lot to add, but I would just maybe say, you know, Jay and my positions didn't exist under the last administration in the form that they do now, which is as senior US government officials with a platform and a mandate and resources. So domestic human rights have an enormous impact on what we do, including the perception that LGBTQI plus human rights are a partisan issue. And I don't think they should be a partisan issue. I think everyone should believe that LGBTQI plus people shouldn't be subjected to discrimination or violence. That's not, you know, a belief that, that should be, that one political party or another should own. I will say that everywhere I go, people ask me about what's happening in the United States. And I think the only way to be authentic in doing this work is to say we don't have all the answers, but we're on a quest towards a more perfect union. And part of what makes us credible is acknowledging our lessons learned, acknowledging our mistakes, and being committed to striving to be better.
And, you know, let's get into those lessons learned then. I think that makes whole sense to me and is this interesting space. We, the Wilson Center, are a nonpartisan institution too, so I appreciate you bringing up the partisanship like interplay between these issues. And I think now moving forward, we can get more into the lessons learned. And we've talked about the challenges, we've talked about the hope, and we've talked about the good things that have already happened. So I'm wondering, we'll start with Special Envoy Stern for this question, is, you know, this interagency report, at least in many of the places I read, was said to be first annual, or there is an idea that there will be more reports to come. I'm not saying give our audience a preview of the future because you really can't, but I am saying I know that there is work to, you know, work on the lessons learned from this interagency report. So I'm wondering what you see as some of the next big steps that need to be taken from from your situation in the U.S. State Department.
I think I unmuted myself. Okay, great. I think, it's before I even blink my eyes, we're going to be working on the next report. And it is a huge lift. So I'm just so delighted that people are reading it and that we have this platform for talking about it. It's very important. If you want to know what the Department of Treasury is doing on LGBTQI inclusion, you shouldn't have to guess. You shouldn't have to know someone who's like an expert in these issues. You shouldn't need to have a friend who works there. You should actually be able to access the information in a systematic way. And that's what this report does. So every year that I'm in this position, we will be working on a report such as this one. And hopefully it'll become a little bit, hopefully it'll get longer and longer each time because the efforts will, right? Exactly. Will just become so great. But, I think there are 3 core lessons learned that I would like to emphasize. Well, maybe 4. Have a senior official in every foreign assistance and foreign policy agency who's charged with LGBTQI inclusion. Ideally, a specialist like Jay or me, rather than someone who is senior and has this on top of many other issues in their portfolio. The second is provide training on these issues. I always emphasize that the elimination of homophobia, transphobia, biphobia, and interphobia is really, really hard. I spent my career doing it, and I'm not done, and I don't have all the answers. So imagine how much harder it is for someone who doesn't have specialized training and who's juggling this issue along with many others. The third piece I'd emphasize is this work needs resourcing. And that's something that I know Jay and I both care a lot about. Resourcing both internally, but also resourcing the sector at large, especially the work of LGBTQI plus civil society organizations and their allies. And then the last 2 things I'd emphasize, because, I snuck in a 5th recommendation, is have a strategy. I just can't emphasize this enough. Have a strategy. I think bureaus and agencies can feel like they're playing whack-a-mole and just reacting to crisis when it comes to LGBTQI issues. And you can be very busy reacting to crisis, but we don't just want to react to crisis. We actually want to move the needle forward. And that takes a deliberate needs assessment, that takes a deliberate consultation process, and it requires setting goals. That's how we actually create transformative change. And then the last piece, which seems so obvious, but actually is indispensable, is we need vocal and regular support by leaders, whether it's the leadership of the, Department of State or USAID or any other mechanism. And I was really sorry that I was unavailable to participate, but there was just an event at the Department of Treasury where Janet Yellen herself spoke. And I'm just trying to imagine what it would be like to be an LGBTQI employee at the Department of Treasury. You don't explicitly work on LGBTQI issues, but you came to work that day and you heard Janet Yellen herself say that everyone at the Department of Treasury has to find some way to be LGBTQI plus inclusive in their work. It's positively transformative. So we know what works. Now we just have to implement it.
And Jay, same question to you.
Sure, and I love, Jessica, the list you just provided because it goes right along with some of the things that we're working on and that I want and hope to see in the next report on our side. In terms of a strategy, we're actually in the process of updating our LGBTQI plus policy. It was first written in 2014 during the Obama administration, and of course the last administration didn't have a policy on LGBTQI plus inclusive development. But we are in the middle of updating that. We are currently conducting consultations with civil society all over the world to really make sure we are hearing from them. We are responding to the challenges that they are identifying for us, and that we are taking that and integrating them into this new policy document. And this policy is really an opportunity for us to reflect, to look at some solution building and genuine consultation that will enable this new policy document to guide us in the years ahead. And as folks might know, policy documents at USAID are really important because they provide the guidance for our colleagues in the country, in Washington, as well as our implementing partners all over the world to show leadership in particular spaces, and to give guidance on how to do the work. And so we're really looking forward to being able to have this policy launched by the time the next report comes out. Another opportunity that we're really looking forward to is the launch of a new public-private partnership from USAID that is going to be focused on LGBTQI plus persons. It has a couple of components of one, really strengthening democratic participation from LGBTQI plus led civil society organizations, particularly in electoral processes. And then looking at how to bolster economic livelihoods of LGBTQI plus people, particularly as we know, our communities were disproportionately impacted through the COVID-19 pandemic. And USAID for this public-private partnership has committed $5 million over 5 years. And so we're really excited, and I hope that we will be launching this by the end of the summer. And then, one other thing that I'm really excited about is that we are working to produce additional sets of sectoral guidances for development practitioners, for activists, for governments that really ensure LGBTQI plus considerations are taken, one, into the humanitarian assistance sector, and two, into economic empowerment and livelihoods. Last year, we produced sector guidances in the education space, as well as in resilience and food security spaces. And those have already been instrumental in helping to identify challenges, examples, lessons learned, best practices, and how our colleagues in those respective sectors can really think about how to be better and ensure that the benefits of those programs are getting to LGBTQI plus persons. And so I'm just really excited about those projects along with many others, but those are the kind of the top 3 things that I'm really looking forward to working on over this next year.
Thank you both. We only have 10 more minutes, but there is a question that I wanted to make sure I was able to ask. So because we have 10 minutes, just be wary of time. When you're in these situations, I mean, you're advancing work that really helps all of us, and we've talked about how it affects national security, and we've talked about how it affects just the livelihoods of LGBTQI plus people around the world, and how that is enough to want to be able to do it and to carry it forward, and why it's important. So my question is, when you're interfacing with other countries that might have a more murky or honestly bad record, how do you approach those situations, and how do you kind of have partner building conversations with places that might be a little bit more contentious when you bring up these issues? I'll start with Jay, if you have a comment on this.
Sure, yeah. I mean, first, I think it is ensuring that people don't want LGBTQI plus persons to face violence, to face stigmatization, to face discrimination. I think starting from that human rights perspective is really important. I think a lot of places that might not go for pro-LGBTQI plus rights, we can probably get them on the same page to let's ensure that there's no violence, there's no discrimination, there's no stigmatization against LGBTQI plus persons. And then I think the next part of that discussion with, particularly non-permissive environments and officials in those spaces is to help them think through how leaving out LGBTQI plus persons in whatever sector we might be talking about is actually detrimental to their development goals, the access, not the access, but the gains that they want to be making for their development work. And so that could be either in the health space, obviously with HIV and AIDS, lots of governments want to help contain that pandemic and ensure that everyone's getting access to the health and medication that they need there. There's really exciting research in the economic space and inclusion and what that looks like when LGBTQI plus folks are left out. And so as governments want to grow economically, inclusion of LGBTQI plus persons is really key to that. And so I think having those conversations around other goals that they have for their country and talking to how including LGBTQI plus persons are part and parcel of obtaining those goals that they have there.
You know, I just took my first international trip, and I ended up going to Malaysia first. And Malaysia sort of symbolized exactly what I wanted for my first destination. It's a country that has criminalized homosexual status or conduct. It has the equivalent of criminal restrictions on so-called cross-dressing. And it has in recent years applied those laws. So they don't just exist as kind of ghost laws on the books. They have, meaning in people's daily lives today. But I made it my first destination because you can always move the needle forward. You can always make progress. In every country on the planet, LGBTQI plus people are fighting for their own basic dignity. And, shame on us if we don't support them, right? They don't have the luxury of not fighting for their own well-being. It's just a question of whether or not we make that easier. So it was a very fast trip. It turns out when you travel as the State Department, every destination you only go to for very short amounts of time. Yeah, it is quick, Alex, very, very fast. So you better drink a lot of coffee and sleep very little. But you do, because you want to maximize your impact. And so, on the first day I met with like-minded countries. I met with some LGBTQI activists who are some of the founders of the movement who've been in the trenches for years, decades, and then Sunday morning, I had like one slot available at like 7:30 in the morning, right? Who wants to meet with a government official at 7:30 in the morning on a Sunday? Well, actually, a lot of people did. A lot of LGBTQI people and a lot of LGBTQI activists in Malaysia did. And they showed up, with like creativity and drive and just enormous vision for how things can be. So I guess I would say, like, how do you approach countries, that have, a poor record on LGBTQI plus rights? Well, number one, you support local LGBTQI advocates, full stop. Two, you use an argument that all people should be entitled to equality before the law. And three, and this is very serious, the US government needs to respond with attention and gravitas when there are unexpected or persistent human rights violations targeting LGBTQI people. And we have to do that anywhere it appears.
Well, we're approaching 3 p.m. and that is, while a, more dark way to end this discussion, it is so important. And that is what I wanted to make sure we were able to get out of this discussion, is why diplomatically it isn't just surface level and it isn't just, talk. There is meeting with activists on the ground and people doing the work in every single country to make their lives better for all of the different goals that you both have like really expertly talked about today. And, I couldn't be more appreciative of both of your time. I know that, with it being Pride Month, and you guys, I think you both have an event tomorrow, at one of our friends, CSIS, which I encourage people to sign up for, because I know those people well over there, and I wish you both the best with the end of your Pride Month programming. And, from the Wilson Center, from myself, from the LGBTQ plus ERG, from our D&I Council, truly thank you both for coming. And I hope that you have a great rest of your afternoon. And for everyone at home, thank you for following along. The video of this conversation is going to be housed on this event page. So if you ever want to come back, please do. And there will be much more of this programming to come. I really think that these conversations are really only the beginning. And, we already know there's going to be a second report. So, we basically are teeing ourselves up for part 2. But again, thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Alex, for organizing this. And to all of your colleagues who we didn't get to meet, thank you and happy Pride.
Happy Pride.
Yes, thank you, Alex, and happy Pride, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.